And we're back for our fourth panel today. We'll look at the museum as context of communication. And it is a great pleasure for me to introduce to you our moderator for the panel, Ines Weizman. She is director of the Bauhaus Institute for the History and Theory of Architecture and Planning and a professor of architectural theory at the Bauhaus Universität Weimar. She's founding director of the Center for Documentary Architecture, CDA, and in 2014, her edited book, Architecture and the Paradox of Dissidence, was published by Routledge. The book Before and After, documenting the architecture of disaster, co-written with Eyal Weizman, was published in the same year by Strecker Press. Her latest book, Dust and Data, Traces of the Bauhaus Across 100 Years, was published in 2019 with Spectre Books. And I might add, it's one of the reasons, of course, why we asked her to participate today, to be the moderator. The installation Repeat Yourself, Laws, Law, and the Culture of the Copy was shown at the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2012 and in 2013 as solo shows in the Architecture Center Vienna and the Buell Architecture Gallery at Columbia University, New York. Earlier research and exhibition projects include cell texts, books, and other works produced in prison together with Eyal Weizman again. Her first exhibited in Fondazione Sandretto Rebaudengo. Ich hoffe, ich habe das richtig. I hope that was correct. In Turin, 2008, 2009, 2014, and 2015. And in 2019, she curated the exhibition of the CDA, The Matter of Data, Tracing the Materiality of Bauhaus Modernism, that was shown at the Bauhaus Museum Weimar and the Liebling House in Tel Aviv, and that resulted in a comprehensive digital archive and research platform about objects, architectures, and protagonists of modernism in exile. So please welcome Ines Weizman.
Thank you for this long introduction for a moderator. I'm really very happy to be here, and thank you for these fantastic few days here in Dessau. As we all know, this was a long and intensive year, and I'm really enjoying to be here to close this year with this conference. I have the pleasure to introduce you to our first presentation, to Fernando Pérez Oyarzún from the Chilean National Fine Arts Museum in Santiago de Chile, which he's directing. He's also the professor at Universität Católica de Chile, where he was also director of the School of Architecture. Fernando was actually trained as an architect at the architectural school in Barcelona, ETSAB, where there's a longer Spanish name, but I don't try my luck that I get through the full title, where he also did a doctorate and has also done some professional work as an architect, but his research was actually mainly in the history and theory of architecture. He authored and was editor of Le Corbusier and South America, and another book was titled The Valparaiso School Open City Group, and another more recent one, Architecture in Chile during the 20th Century. I'm already intrigued by the combination in his biography of moving from architecture to become the director of that museum, and I hope we will hear more about that trajectory, and I'm welcoming you to come here to speak. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this invitation. I feel quite honored to be here, and I think it's the same for my museum. I will enter the subject in a kind of oblique way, but I think I will be able to transmit something about the connections of Bauhaus and Latin America. To begin with, a few words about the museum, completely unknown for you, I'm sure. So, founded in 1880, the National Fine Art Museum is probably the oldest of its kind in Latin America. Its collection includes more than 5,000 pieces, going from classical painting and sculpture to the digital register of contemporary performances. Although modest in comparison with European and North American art museums, almost 400,000 visitors a year make it a referential art museum in the country. The museum, as you see, is housed in a classical building erected in 1910 on the occasion of the independence of the country's centennial, and its exhibition rooms circle around an amazing glass-covered public space. Sorry, it's okay. Both the collections, the quality of the exhibitions, and its privileged urban location makes it a relevant institution in Latin America. In September 1991, Sheila Hicks donated the piece Hidden Treasures to the museum. Since then, it has been part of the collection. Her donation, as you see, reminded, as she herself stated, her first exhibition, which had taken place precisely in this museum in 1958, which apparently marked a special moment in her life and career. Hidden Treasures is a small but meaningful piece. It consists of 2 wool thread balls. Different colors have been mixed up in each one of the balls. The bigger one, more colorful, shows a mixture of magenta, green, and blue. The smaller is darker, more monochrome, dominating brown and cream with a few touches of dark touches. The apparent simplicity of the piece hides richness of colors and textures coming from the different layers of handmade thread. Retrospectively, Hidden Treasures can be understood as the small-scale starting point of some major works of Sheila. The couple of color wool balls can be seen as the 0 degree of Sheila Hicks' art, a radically elemental version of her work and her poetic metonymia. Thus, despite of its modesty, the piece has the potential of telling the story of her development as an artist and the connection it has with the Bauhaus aesthetic and pedagogical tradition. And Ariadne's thread, we can learn through it about Sheila's education and her evolution as an artist. Also, it tells something about her art sources and the way she has been able to articulate, starting from them, his personal project. Most interesting that this project includes on one side, the Bauhaus connection, as well as the Latin American and Chile playing a role in this process. Born in Nebraska, US in 1934, Sheila Hicks lives and works since many years in Paris, where she married and then divorced the Chilean painter Enrique Sañartu. After being grown up in the Midwest and living some years in Chicago, she ended up studying art at Yale in 1954, where, among others, was taught by Joseph and Annie Albers. It is already a well-known fact that Joseph Albers was part of the crew that emigrated from Germany to the United States after the collapse of the Bauhaus in Germany, and collaborated in the process of disseminating Bauhaus ideas and pedagogy process in North America. It needs to be specially highlighted that Albers had himself been educated in the Bauhaus before developing his career as a teacher, parallel to his artistic production as a painter, engraver, or photographer. This circumstance made him a particularly representative Bauhaus character. His focus turned to be a sort of classical within the 20th century art education, and his ability to enthuse his disciples was widely recognized. You know that artists as the importance of Rauschenberg or Yad or Cage were among his students in Black Mountain and Richard Serra in Yale, where he had finally settled in 1950. It was during her stay at Yale, probably having been recognized as a talented student, that Albers offered Sheila in 1957, after being awarded a bachelor degree, a Fulbright scholarship to visit Chile, and eventually teach there. Accepted the offering, Sheila didn't know exactly the possible implications of this adventurous travel. She didn't suspect that this would finally become one of the most significant turning points in her career, an epiphany which would open her mind and sensitivity to new cultural stimuli, reorienting her artistic interest. Without having planned it, Hicks would confront her Bauhaus-oriented education with local cultural manifestation and imposing geographical environments. And these would let her retrace her plan as an artist. On the occasion of the inauguration of a retrospective exhibition this year at the Pre-Columbian Museum in Santiago, Hicks has explicitly recognized the importance of this Latin American contact in her life and work. The connection of Joseph Albers with Chile and Latin America went back to 1952, when the new dean of the School of Architecture of the Catholic University, Sergio Larraín García Moreno, invited him and his wife, Annie, to visit the school and deliver a kind of version of his focus during 2 months. Larraín had been the protagonist of a significant school reform which had a peak in 1949. One of the main battles during these reforms had to do with the initial or preliminary studies, confronting the classical academic introduction of the Beaux-Arts tradition with a new abstract approach of a course called Pure Composition, which had been introduced in the curriculum by a young and talented teacher, Alberto Cruz. In addition to open the school to the international scenario, the presence of Albers would reinforce, at least in Larraín's mind, this new tendency. In June 1953, Albers, who at the time was 65, arrived in Santiago. He would visit Peru as well this same year. As initially planned, he delivered a version of his focus during a couple of months, from June 15 to August 15. Additionally, he participated of the social circle around Sergio Larraín. The presence of Albers would be a turning point in the history of the school. Alberto Pivonka, then the architect in charge of the first year studio, would adopt Albert's methods and ideas and made them the core of a course he delivered until his death in 1992. He did so firstly in the School of Architecture until 1967, and then both in the School of Art and that of Design. This must be one of the most lasting Bauhaus pedagogical tradition, at least in Latin America. Annie made also part of the pedagogic expedition and gave birth to a noteworthy textile art branch within the art school. Hicks' visit to Chile should therefore be understood as part of this series of contact with Albers and the North American academic milieu promoted by Sergio Larraín. In fact, Sewell Silman, Albert's former students at Black Mountains and Yale, visited also the school in 1958. As a result of that, a Chilean artist, Eduardo Vilches, recently awarded the National Art Prize, came to study at Yale. Back in Chile, Vilches implemented the well-known interaction of color course based on Albert's theories. This course is delivered until now by Vilches himself or some of his disciples. Chile was the final destination for Sheila, but she decided to make the travel itself an experience. Once arrived in Ecuador, he continued making use of local transport, sharing with humble locals and opening her eyes towards the fascinating reality she was discovering all around. The key fact that Hicks, who until then considered herself a painter and a photographer, discovered was the Andean textile art. She had been already interested in the subject while studying at Yale. The practice was still culturally alive, and craftsmanship, and in addition to that, had illustrious precedents in the Quechua and Aymara cultures. Sheila seemed to have turned deeply fascinated by that highly developed and sophisticated tradition. She discovered that, in addition to a craft, it represented a way of thinking, calculating, and representing the world. Still today, she considers it as the highest textile tradition in the world. Once in Santiago, and in addition to doing some teaching in the school, Sheila got in contact with Sergio Larraín Echenique, the son of the dean of the school. He was, by the time, a talented photographer beginning his career. Later on, he would go to France to work for Cartier-Bresson. He is today recognized, he recently passed away, he is today recognized as one of the leading photographers of the Latin American 20th century. Together with the young Larraín, Hicks went on with her geographic crossing, reaching up to Tierra del Fuego, the Patagonian extreme of Latin America, and that was in 58. Together with the young Larraín, Hicks went on this crossing, as I say, and after that, she organized with Larraín an exhibition that took place in our museum, held between April and June 1958. This was probably the first one in Hicks' career. She says that in the postcard I showed in the beginning. And probably the last one as a painter and a photographer. We don't have a catalog, at least in the museum, but only some pictures probably taken by Larraín himself. Therefore, we know that it consisted of pieces of a very significant size. After the exhibition, Hicks would return to Yale and complete there his master course in 1959. She was then definitely interested in textile art. This interest would continue in France, where he contacted the textile scholar and ethnologist Raoul Darcourt, and also during a long stay in Guerrero, Mexico, during the early 60s. The travel to Chile and South America ended up being an epiphany for Sheila. This seems to have been the definite stimuli to turn her a textile artist. From that time on, the possibilities not only of wool but also of fiber in a wider sense would be her main concern. This concern about materiality as a starting point was not alien to Bauhaus ideology and to Albert's sensitivity. One can describe Hicks' art as deconstructing and monumentalizing weaving, exploring up to its limits fiber possibilities as a form of space producing. She covers all different scales, from the miniature of hidden treasures to the grand murals he did for the Ford Foundation in 1967. Her work has sometimes to deal with different forms of weaving, but sometimes it's before and beyond weaving. Even the word textile is unable to satisfy Sheila Hicks' operations and procedures. The importance of her Andean inspiration is explicitly recognized in the exhibition held this year in the Chilean Museum of Pre-Columbian Art in Santiago, which, by the way, was founded by the same Sergio Larraín García Moreno, based in his incredible personal collection of Pre-Columbian art. The exhibition, called, as you see, Re-Encounter, referring to this trouble of the 58, disposed a group of Sheila's works confronted with pre-Columbian textile pieces. In Hicks' work, one can find an enjoyment of color, texture, materiality, and all the possibilities of interweaving fibers. For her, as in Semper's architectural theory, weaving is a way of conceiving and recreating the world, beginning with the thread and the knot and progressing into all complexity of textile construction. The development of Sheila Hicks' oeuvre should obviously be related to the dissemination of Bauhaus ideas. We already know that tapestry found various expressions in modern and avant-garde art, but the presence of Annie Albers and others in the Bauhaus and the initial interest for crafts and different forms of materials had a significant place within the complexity and variety of Bauhaus environment. The presence of the Albers couple in the USA after the Bauhaus diaspora was, of course, crucial for Hicks' education and for the orientation that finally took her art. Her career can be envisaged, at least partially, as the result of the influence of this creative diaspora, which, due to the historical circumstances, brought not only Bauhaus ideas, but also Bauhaus characters to each corner of the world. At least in her youth, Hicks was part of the network established between Bauhaus and South America, specifically of those associated with Joseph Albers. That wide network included visits, personal contacts, and even art or architectural commissions. In first place, there were the masters, such as Walter Gropius, Hannes Meyer, and Mies van der Rohe. But also we found Bauhaus students, such as Tibor Weiner and Paul Linder. Sheila Hicks and Sewell Silman were part of Albert's effort to prolong the connections he had established with Chile in 1953, reassuring his international presence and the influence upon the school's curriculum. However, the development of Hicks points to a wider and richer set of relationships. Her move from painting and photography to weaving and textile art was mainly detonated by her Latin American experience and the local practices of textile art she discovered there. The connections of handicraft and art were part of Bauhaus ideals from its very beginning. Hicks' Latin American epiphany can be understood as a kind of reenactment of the Bauhaus principles, happened in a completely different cultural context and perhaps with different results. Although fertilized by popular practices and old textile traditions, originally attached to daily uses and objects, Hicks envisaged the possibility of a new art practice starting from them. It is usually said that Bauhaus sought to make avant-garde abstract art closer to life, producing new design objects. In Hicks' case, Latin American craftsmanship and textile tradition fertilized her imagination in order to conceive new art forms. Thus, she brought this traditional weaving experience to new artistic explorations. Hidden Treasures summarize the richness of this process, especially from the side of materiality. Except for some geometric traces, Hicks did not show any interest in Andean traditional iconography. She was, of course, attracted by their color management, but above all, she was interested in the possibility offered by textile materiality, by fiber as an art principle. Thus, she went back from weaving to wool thread, and from this elemental base, she re-elaborates something different, both in terms of forms, expression, and even scale. Another element that can be highlighted in Sheila Hicks' experience is the connection with the pedagogical environment. Different from another avant-garde branches, Bauhaus emerged and developed in a scholar milieu. It is a school in the metaphorical sense of a group of artists and thinkers sharing certain views and principles, but also in the literal sense of an educational institution. And Albers visited Latin America mainly for pedagogical reasons, and so did Hicks or Silman. Our National Fine Art Museum established from the beginning and until now a counterpoint between traditional and contemporary art. Subsequently, it has been attentive to the main and art current developments since its foundation. For this reason, had been involved with Bauhaus. In 1976, an international Bauhaus exhibition that circulated internationally was received in the museum. And recently, in 2014, a Bauhaus Films Festival was also held there. This year, centennial commemoration had been the occasion of planning an installation which will underline the social meaning of the Bauhaus and the complexity of this phenomenon. The proposition by the artist and designer José Delano would install a sentence of 100 words by Walter Gropius in the museum hall. Each one of the letters will be the support to receive a set of pamphlets. They will be offered as a gift to the public, dealing with different aspects of the Bauhaus history, characters, idea, products, or event. Thus, each one of the visitors will be able to build his or her Bauhaus album. The exhibition should have been inaugurated in a week, but it has been to be postponed due to the current circumstances in the country. So, pulling from hidden treasures as if it were an Ariadne's thread, one discovers a complex and fascinating network of ideas, places, and characters. They certainly speak about the dissemination of Bauhaus ideas, but they also represent a conversation and hybridization process. Once again, behind this work, we find the fertility of the encounter of the new and the old, the tradition and the avant-garde, the elemental and the complex, of form and materiality. We can therefore dare to say that Hidden Treasures revisits in its own, a particular way, the origins of Bauhaus poetics, tense by the polarity of arts and crafts, forms and material. Thank you very much.